Today is February 16th. It's the 47th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. If you've been listening from the start, some of this may sound a little familiar, and if you haven't, it'll all be new to you. Either way, enjoy the show. The first 911 call is placed on this day in 1968. Before this, if you had an emergency, you had to know the direct number for the police, the fire department, or ambulance. And in large cities, that could be a whole host of different numbers to call depending on where you live or where you are when calamity befalls you. In 1957, the National Fire Chiefs Association suggests one uniform number to be used nationwide by anyone for any emergency. That good idea sits around for 10 years, until President Johnson's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice gets involved. And then the Federal Communications Commission comes on board along with AT&T to determine what number to use for just such a thing. By 1967, this collection of minds has settled on the number 911. AT&T, who pretty much have a monopoly on phone service in those days, suggests the number because it's simple, easy to remember, and can be dialed quickly. Plus, they already have the numbers 611 and 411 in use for customer service and directory assistance, so it wouldn't cost them much to add a third 11 number. Congress passes a bill, and it's official. But before AT&T can get their system up and running, they're beaten to the punch by a local carrier in Alabama. Bob Gallagher, president of Alabama Telephone, is perturbed that the smaller local and regional services, independent of AT&T, are not included in the planning process. So he sets his mind to being the first carrier to offer an emergency service number. Bob Gallagher, plant manager Bob Fitzgerald, and their team work 24/7 to get their system set up, modifying their equipment and building new circuitry in just a week to be ready for their launch. At 2 p.m. on this day, February 16th, 1968, Alabama Speaker of the House Rankin Fite places the first 911 call in Haleyville, Alabama, and the universal emergency number is officially in use. Remarkably, by the 1990s, still only half of the country is covered by 911 service, and as of today, there still is not 100% coverage across the entire country. On this day in 1987, the trial of John Demjanjuk begins in Jerusalem, Israel. Demjanjuk is accused of being Ivan the Terrible, an SS guard at the Nazi death camp Treblinka during World War II. Ivan Demjanjuk is born in 1920 in Soviet-occupied Ukraine. His family nearly starves to death in Joseph Stalin's forced famine of the Ukrainian people in the 1930s. He's drafted into the Soviet Army in 1941 and then captured by the Germans in 1942 in eastern Crimea. As a prisoner of war, he's transferred to a Nazi concentration camp. After the war, he emigrates to America in 1952, changes his name to John, becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1958, settles outside Cleveland, Ohio, and gets a job at a Ford auto plant. In 1975, the U.S. Department of Justice opens an investigation into his alleged participation in atrocities at the Treblinka death camp. He is identified as a Treblinka guard by Jewish survivors who pick his photo out of a photo lineup. But he's also identified by a Soviet who claims to have served with him at a different camp, Sobibor. In 1981, he's stripped of his U.S. citizenship, and in 1986 is extradited to Israel to stand trial for his alleged actions at Treblinka. At the trial that begins on this day in 1987, survivors testify that he is Ivan the Terrible, a guard who operates the death chamber at Treblinka. An identification card is found in Soviet archives that supports the claim of his collaboration with the SS. However, the card places him at that different camp, Sobibor, and not Treblinka. And Demjanjuk testifies that he was a POW throughout the war. He is convicted of being Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka and is sentenced to death. While he appeals his conviction, the Soviet Union collapses, and suddenly many documents related to Soviets' involvement in SS death camps become available, none of which support the claim of Demjanjuk as the guard at Treblinka. But they do point to a different person, Ivan Marchenko, as possibly being Ivan the Terrible. Demjanjuk's conviction is overturned by an Israeli court of appeals in 1993. That same year, after a U.S. finding that the Department of Justice withheld information that would have been helpful to his defense, his U.S. citizenship is restored. In 2002, Demjanjuk's U.S. citizenship is once again revoked, based on new evidence developed by the Department of Justice of his involvement at Sobibor and another camp, Flossenburg. In 2005, his deportation is ordered. While appealing that, German prosecutors present murder charges against him for deaths at Sobibor, and he's extradited to Germany in 2009. Demjanjuk is charged with 28,060 counts of accessory to murder. The documentary evidence presented at trial, including that identification card, shows that while as a prisoner of war, Demjanjuk volunteers for guard training, possibly to escape the brutal conditions he faces as a Soviet POW in German camps, and he's ordered to serve as a guard at Sobibor in Flossenburg. No evidence is presented of his participation in any killings. In 2011, John Demjanjuk is convicted of being a guard at Sobibor and is sentenced to 5 years in prison. Around that same time, a report surfaces in the National Archives, a report written in 1985 by the FBI Cleveland Field Office, a report that states the identification card used as evidence against Demjanjuk is, quote, quite likely fabricated by the KGB. John Demjanjuk dies in a German nursing home in 2012 while awaiting his appeal. In his obituary, his son states Demjanjuk was a victim too, saying, quote, history will show Germany used him as a scapegoat to blame helpless Ukrainian POWs for the deeds of Nazi Germans. In that same obituary, David Van Huyden, whose family was murdered at Sobibor, says of Demjanjuk's final sentence, quote, whether it's 3, 4, 5 years doesn't really matter. He took part. He volunteered. There are 319 days left in the year.